So getting involved in a lawsuit is not an absolute certainty. Unfortunately, it does happen. What can you do as a landlord to maybe prevent, or at the very least hold off, the possibility that you get sued by one of your tenants? We're talking all about how to prevent costly lawsuits from ever happening in the first place. Let's get started. So I want to talk about 5 ways that you can avoid a legal nightmare. The first of which is to get your head around basic landlord-tenant law. If you're not familiar with your state's property code, or you're not familiar with your local jurisdiction's rules for landlords, find out where you can get something in print that you can read and use as a resource. You simply don't want to just start the landlording business without getting familiar with state and local laws. You want to know early on in the process what your rights are as a landlord. What kinds of things can you demand of your tenant? What kinds of things can you not demand of your tenant? You want to make sure you know where that bright line exists so that you make sure you're on the right side of it. You definitely want to be familiar with the kinds of tools at your disposal. What's in a good lease? What good provisions of the law can you rely on? And what information can you use based on the experience of people who've done this before? One of the things that I strongly recommend of particularly new landlords is to get involved with groups of other landlords. Find someone who's done 10 times what you are in the middle of. If you've got 1 rent house, find somebody with 10. If you've got 5 rent houses, find somebody with 50. Because the wealth of knowledge that that individual has is going to be invaluable to you. They will have experienced things that you will be able to avoid because they're going to show you exactly how to avoid problems. Your next key step is getting yourself a watertight lease. Everything starts and stops with a good lease, and it's got to be appropriate for your state and local jurisdiction. If you're not sure where to find a good lease, I don't recommend you simply jump on Google and do a generic search. You're not going to know if that lease is specific to your state and whether or not that lease covers all the things you're going to need in a good, strong lease. Among some of the better provisions are provisions that restrict the tenant in a way that protects your property and that offer some kind of consequence for any breaches of that agreement. You definitely want a lease that has some teeth in it, and you need to know how to be able to utilize the tools in that lease. For example, you want to know how late fees work and how to implement late fees and what an appropriate late fee is. This way you can enforce timely payment and you can make sure that you've got a clear message to your tenant about how rent is paid, when rent is paid, and what you do in the event that rent is not paid on time. But the key to a good, strong lease is knowing its parts. What does your lease say about repairs? What are your duties and obligations when your tenant comes to you with a substantial repair request? How quickly must you respond? And in what way are you obligated to respond in a timely fashion? What about inspections on the property? Do you have to give written notice? How much written notice do you have to give? In what way do you deliver that notice? What about that security deposit? How much of a deposit can you charge? What can you deduct from the security deposit during the lease? After the lease? What rules are you subject to when it comes to returning the security deposit? And finally, how is a lease terminated? Can it be terminated in the middle because of a default? What is a default? And what constitutes enough of a default for you to be able to terminate a lease and send the matter into an eviction court? Does a lease termination have to be in writing? If so, does it matter how you send that termination notice to your tenant? All of these are important factors, and your lease should address all of them and more. One absolute necessity in the landlord-tenant business is excellent communication. Do you have a pathway between yourself and your tenant to get your message across effectively? Make sure you've got a method for getting messages to and from your tenant, particularly those that have to do with the property in emergency situations. And reserve all of your communication to a written format. You certainly don't want to exclusively communicate with your tenant through oral communication because there's no record of it. You want to maintain a good record of the kinds of things that you and your tenant discuss so that if you later have to demonstrate to a court that you shared information or you made a requirement and you notified the tenant properly, you can demonstrate your acts and what the tenant failed to do after being given proper notice. Additionally, you want to be able to say, every form of communication that I present is something that I'll be comfortable presenting in an open forum like a court. You don't want to have to shy away from communication because you were overly abrasive or maybe extra aggressive. You always want to communicate with your tenants in a business-like manner and presume that any written communication you share with your tenants will someday find its way in front of a judge. If you get into a position where you are in conflict with your tenant, perhaps you need assistance with your communication. Consider a mediation or some kind of dispute resolution format that'll help you and your tenant resolve whatever issues otherwise can't be resolved by you both. Maybe sometimes having a neutral third party helps you get a problem resolved without the need for a costly lawsuit. Certainly, if you and your tenant are at loggerheads and simply cannot reach some kind of agreement, it might be necessary to simply agree to terminate the lease and for each of you to go your separate ways. All of this can be reached through a written modification of your lease, which you and your tenant sign, bringing the relationship to an end. If you find today's topic helpful, don't hesitate to give us a like. Your questions and comments, please add those here. And if you're not a subscriber yet, please consider subscribing. But you should always know where your line in the sand is when it comes to needing legal counsel. You don't want to be stuck in a place where you've got a conflict that you know you simply cannot resolve with your tenant and then desperately look for an attorney at that point. Have somebody in mind, somebody that you know and trust that you can turn to if the event calls for it. Understand that at certain points, you're going to need the court's assistance, particularly when it comes to non-payment of rent, or if you've got an instance of multiple non-rent lease violations that should lead to an eviction. If you're unsure how to move a case forward in the eviction court, you want to make sure that you have access to the court either on your own or through some legal professional who can help get your problem resolved. Understand that along with your lease, written notices that you've delivered to your tenant are the next best piece of evidence that you can produce. Whether that's a notice to vacate for non-payment of rent, whether that's notices of default for non-rent lease violations, your ability to preserve a record of your notifications to that tenant of their violations of the lease might ultimately spare you thousands in legal costs because you're able to demonstrate to the court your diligence and your readiness to issue a notice every time the tenant was in violation. If your strategy is to prevent legal disputes, you have to stay on top of your game. You can't simply stand passively and hope that things work themselves out. If laws change and new requirements step in for you as a landlord, you need to be aware of those. Additionally, you don't want to simply leave your lease in the same format it was the original time you signed it. If you're keeping a tenant for multiple years and never raising the rent, one dispute that'll come in is whether or not that tenant is paying you enough money for your increased cost in taxes and repairs. But if you have not taken the affirmative steps of each year slightly increasing the rent to account for these increased costs, you're going to find yourself in a dispute that is completely preventable. Another effective way of preventing problems before they occur is to have an excellent screening process. By eliminating tenants who are simply not a good fit for your rental, you're going to prevent the need for issuing notice after notice after notice for non-payment for someone who if you had researched their employment history or their earning capacity, you would see they simply could not afford your rental. By doing a thorough background check, you can ensure that the ideal tenant is in place so that you can have a successful landlord-tenant relationship. You also want to make sure that you're keeping an accurate ledger of all payments. Remember, rent is just one of the things you might collect. There are also fees. Sometimes there are fines, maybe from the HOA or repair costs. You want to be able to demonstrate potentially to your tenant a certain amount is owed because of these fees or fines or costs that have been incurred outside of just rent. By keeping accurate records of all of these and being able to demonstrate this easily in writing to your tenant, you might prevent future litigation when there is a dispute about what is owed, when, and why. Naturally, litigation is expensive and complicated. Sometimes it can take months. Other times it could take years to reach a final resolution. But many times, this kind of dispute is completely preventable if you want to avoid the cost and the hassle and the stress of unnecessary litigation. Be proactive and take the kinds of steps we've talked about today to make sure that your landlord-tenant business runs smoothly. I hope you've enjoyed watching today's video. Make sure you watch the rest of our content on this channel. YouTube seems to think that this video right here is the next best thing for you. Enjoy that, and anything else that I can help you with, please let me know. But until next time, landlords, happy leasing.